Okay. Professor Andrew Feinberg, welcome to Aporia Podcast. How are you doing today?
Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview. I wanted to start off with talking about something of your beginnings in philosophy. This year marks the 55th anniversary of events that were very significant, I know, for you, but also at a global level, namely the events of May 68 in France. These were protests that swept across the country for almost 2 months. Many different thinkers have written about it. You have written about it, but you were also there in person. So I was wondering, before we get into maybe your own personal experience, if you could just give a little bit of a description for our listeners of what exactly were the events of May 68?
Well, the students, there was a small student movement in Paris in 68, mostly around the war in Vietnam. And some of the students came to the Sorbonne from another campus. There's a large courtyard in the center of the Sorbonne, and they were rallying there, and the police arrived and arrested them all. And this was shocking. The French university had never been invaded by the police before. And this goes back to the 12th century. So the effect of this was to enrage the students. The university was closed by the cops, and thousands of students demanded to be let back in. And that led to conflict on the streets, essentially riots. And since the streets were covered with cobblestones, all you needed was a screwdriver or something to pick up the first one, and then all the rest came up easily, and you could toss them at the cops.
Wow.
And so the police had really a difficult time. And gradually the numbers grew until there were tens of thousands of students fighting to get back into the Sorbonne. And this then led to the construction of barricades, which is an old French tradition. Mm-hmm. So you'd think you'd be back in 1848. And the police decided to overcome to chase the students out of the barricades. And this led to tremendously violent assault on the demonstrators. Thousands of people were injured. And that then provoked a reaction from the society. The population was outraged, and the unions picked up this outrage. And since they had had a lot of trouble too with the police, but not much success in fighting with them, they somehow got the impression that maybe this was the sort of culmination of this very harsh police regime that had been installed by de Gaulle. And they went on a general strike. This was on May 13th. That general strike was supposed to end at the end of the day, but it didn't. The workers seized their factories, and within a few days, the entire economy of France was blocked. The workers simply took the factories, they put out a red flag in front of the factory, locked the doors, and kicked out any management personnel who were around, and refused to budge. So this is quite astonishing. Marxists had been talking about the general strike for generations, and here it was in France, in an advanced industrial society. And that then led to further violence in the streets, and calls for revolution. So what escalated, this escalated from students wanting to get back to their classes to socialist revolution as an objective of the movement. And it spread not only to these factories that were closed, but once the general strike was happened, everybody was concerned. And it spread from the working class and the students to the administrations of the society. There was a management union that went on strike. Government ministries went on strike. And finally, it seemed that the government had only the police and the army behind it. And so this is what then encouraged people to think they could overthrow the government, because it was just generalized disobedience. So de Gaulle, I should have mentioned that de Gaulle was president of the Republic at this time. He went to Germany, where the French army was posted as part of NATO. And actually, no, I think they had left NATO at this point, but the troops were in Germany, and the army, he asked the commanders to support him, and they agreed. And then he flew back to France and made a speech in which he called for the defense of the Republic against the rioters. And from there, things kind of degenerated. It's hard to explain. You know, we have the notion of riots and violence from, say, what's happened in the, what was the movement called? The
Occupy Wall Street, or
that was pretty peaceful, but the
right.
more recent one that was caused by the murder of George Floyd,
Yes.
gave us images of violence. And of course, this was part of what was happening in France too. But there's also a kind of sense of restraint. People were not shooting at the police, and the police were not shooting at the demonstrators. There was a sense that you had to show a certain kind of humanity in order to appeal to the general public.
Right.
Because it was never really a question of actual violence by itself being sufficient to change the government or to stop the rioting.
Yeah.
It's a question of public opinion ultimately.
Yeah.
And so when the government essentially threatened civil war, there was a moment in which you could imagine that the other side would take it up. But in fact, the movement wasn't ready for civil war. And so it gradually disintegrated.
Yeah.
And so, but still, there are many new themes that emerged in the May events that are still valid. Although it did not overthrow the government, it did, in a sense, overthrow the Communist Party. That's to say, the Communist Party was very reluctant throughout and negotiated the end of the strikes. And it didn't want revolution, and that became clear. So the leftists who were in favor of revolution now knew that they could not rely on the Communist Party, that it was not an ally, but in fact was an enemy. And this also went along with a distaste for the Soviet-style organization of communist society and demands for workers' council regime. So the idea of socialism was radically altered in France by what happened in '68.
Yeah.
And there's also the emergence of very important fraction of the middle strata supporting the movement was quite unheard of.
Yeah.
in the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, the administrative cadre all left if they could.
Right.
Almost no one wanted to be associated with the Bolshevik Revolution. But in this case, very large numbers of administrative personnel of all kinds did associate themselves with the revolution. And so that gave you a very different image of what the agent of revolution was in an advanced society. It was no longer simply factory workers, but had extended way out beyond that to the population, essentially the population as a whole.
Right.
So the May events really had a big impact, and sort of, well, they gave you a sense of what could happen in a revolution in an advanced industrial society, something rather different from what was from the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in the early part of the century.
Right. I think it's very interesting you mentioned this difference of organization, a different kind of politics. There's a wonderful line in the book that you wrote about your both experience in and analysis of the May 68 events when poetry ruled the streets. If you don't mind, I'd like to quote it and then maybe talk about it a little bit.
Sure.
But you say what was unique about the Sorbonne, what made it the model of the entire revolt, was its refusal of all leadership. People normally fear revolutions on any scale, not necessarily because they fear disorder, for in fact, disorder can be exhilarating, but because they fear the severity of a new order which succeeds the abandon. On the reverse side of the wild card that is revolution lurks the constant threat of dictatorship. Herein was the beauty of the Sorbonne of these times. It fought not only against the regime, but against the revolution, or at least the revolutionary tradition. Here was the revolution within the revolution, a radically new model proposed to the 20th century. A revolution without dictatorship, ruled only by imagination. I was especially struck by that last part, ruled by imagination. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that term and what you think it means that in terms of the possibilities that May 68 maybe opened up but haven't been realized yet.
Well, yeah, the slogan of the Russian Revolution was included the Soviets. What was it? This was all power to the Soviets.
Right.
This was all power to the imagination. Right? That was the May 68 version. So why imagination? Well, I think 1968 in France, the country was quite rich. Of course, it's richer now, but it was a rich country. And you could imagine doing things differently. You have enough wealth, you can reconfigure the society. You're not just scraping the barrel trying to survive. Survival is no longer an issue. The issue now is how you want to live. And once people stopped obeying, it's kind of astonishing to me. I was a teenager practically. And I'd never seen anything like this. I mean, I had seen some demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, but the idea that a society would simply cease to exist, all its institutions would be shattered all at once because no one would obey. That astounded me. It was what Walter Benjamin would call a messianic moment. And in that context, you have to rethink how you wanted to organize your society because nothing any longer was working. There are all these resources and wealth and skills, but nothing was configured any longer in a way that made sense. So you could then imagine a complete reconstitution of the society. And that was, in fact, a very widely shared idea that
Yeah.
we could now change everything. Everything was up for grabs.
Yeah.
And so imagination appears then as a, you know, when the book is called When Poetry Ruled the Streets, right? Poetry being the idea of some sort of break from the everyday, you know, an aesthetic moment in which you reconfigure the world according to your desires. And so this idea, of course, in practical terms, you would have to deal with the actual realities, but those realities were all underdetermined. There was no necessary reason for the society to be organized the way it was. You could reorganize it in other ways.
Right. Right.
That's the poetry.
Yeah. A sense that things could be remade in a different image through invention and creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously this contradicts any notion of bureaucratic dictatorship of the sort that existed in the Soviet Union. No one was interested in that. It really seemed like a dead idea. So there were various attempts to, create manifestos but in fact, it's just people were waiting for the movement to arrive at some destination. Of course, it did not, but I suppose it could have happened. There was a moment when it seemed like the government might collapse because of the fact that it just, all the administrations, everybody except the police really were in revolt. And there was a moment when the Socialist Party appeared to be willing to lead the movement, to take over the government and lead the movement. And it would have contended with a very rambunctious movement indeed. It would have been very difficult for it to actually control what happened, and certainly impossible to establish a dictatorship. So it was not totally implausible that there could have been a completely new version of socialism created in France in 1968.
That's really fascinating. I was wondering if you, I'm sure you had a whole wealth of experiences that happened. I was wondering if there was a particular memory that you could share that you felt really stood out from what would probably many standout moments.
Oh, there were many.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll mention two things that were extraordinary. One day I was at the Sorbonne, and some students were organizing a march, and then they said they were going to go to the factory, the Renault factory in Boulogne-Billancourt, which is in the south suburbs of Paris, where in 1936, the last time there was a really major social movement in France, this factory was the starting point, the spark that that sparked the fire. This is a huge automobile factory, and we were going to go there and talk to the workers, relate to the workers, because they had just begun to take over this factory and shut out the management. And this was just at the beginning of the occupations, right after May 13th. So there was a column of students that got bigger and bigger. I don't know how many people there were, thousands of students. And we marched and marched and marched, because it's a long way from the Sorbonne to Boulogne-Billancourt. And when we finally got there, the workers, a lot of the factory was closed. We could not get in to talk to the workers. But workers lined up on top of the building and looking down on us. And we sung the International with them. And there was a kind of moment of solidarity, that was completely extraordinary. There was a poster that some of the students were holding, which said, the workers take up the struggle from the hands of the students. So it was like a switching the movement now from a student movement to a proletarian movement. This was happening right there, and we were in the middle of it.
Wow.
So that was an absolutely extraordinary event for me.
Yeah.
The other event is more mysterious. After de Gaulle made a speech in which we thought that well, let's see if I can get this right. The student march moved across the bridges to the right bank. And up to this time, we had always been on the left bank, which is where the university is. And the students gathered, I think it was around the Place de la République, to listen to a talk that de Gaulle was supposed to give, and which we thought might include concessions. But in fact, it was another one of his ferocious attacks on the movement. And so everyone was angry and upset. And there must have been, I don't know, maybe 30, 50,000 people, a lot of people. And so somebody called for the destruction of the stock exchange, which was in the neighborhood. Okay, so we started off on a march from the République to the Bourse, or the stock exchange. And the march was very, there's a lot of talk, right? A lot of slogans, and people picked up, they went into construction sites and picked up the hard hats and pioche, clubs. And so it was a pretty kind of scary, actually. And this was happening at night. So that made it even more sort of Walpurgis night event, and at one point, the movement, the march broke into two parts. I don't know why, but I was in one part, and then the other part moved off on a different street. Maybe it was to escape from the cops. I'm not sure. The idea was that at least one branch of the movement would make it to the Bourse and burn it down. My branch led to a T crossing. Far ahead, you could see where there was a very large building, and the street, you'd have to go to the right or the left at that point to get around that large building. And it was not clear what that building was. And a lot of big buildings in Paris, administrative buildings of all sorts. So after a while marching toward that building, people started in front of us to say, shh. And pretty soon, everybody in this march was on tiptoes, trying to keep quiet. But we didn't know why. Maybe it was the police who were coming and we were trying to escape by being quiet. It seems absurd. 20,000 people can't really be that quiet. Mm-hmm. But as we got closer, it became clear why we were being quiet. The building that we were leading toward was a hospital, and it had a big sign saying "Quiet Zone." Mm-hmm. So I was incredibly struck by this. I mean, you hear always that, you know, riots are bestial, that people who are engaged in violent struggles are not human anymore. They don't care about anything. We were perfectly polite. We were in solidarity with these unfortunate people who were stuck in the hospital with diseases and broken limbs and whatever. We didn't want to wake them up for nothing. So we were quiet. So this civility in the midst of rioting is quite astonishing.
Mm-hmm.
And after, of course, we went beyond the hospital, the slogans started up again, the people began breaking into construction sites again, and we got to the stock exchange where some of the marchers went into the building and started fires.
Mm-hmm.
Now, unfortunately, or rather fortunately, we didn't burn it down. It's a nice building, but the firemen were able to put it out. And so still the whole episode really made a huge impression on me. Just like with the workers, these are astonishing events that you could never imagine happening to you.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you for sharing those. Those are really, really amazing examples. I wanted to also talk about another a figure who was present, a philosopher who is very important to the May 68 events, but then also has played an important role in your own work, and is the subject of your most recent book, The Ruthless Critique of Everything, and that's philosopher Herbert Marcuse. I was wondering if you could first tell us a little bit about who Herbert Marcuse was, and then tell us something about your relationship with him.
Yeah, Marcuse was a German philosopher who studied with Husserl and Heidegger in the 20s and the late 20s, early 30s. And then Heidegger, his teacher, joined the Nazi Party. And in 1933, it was clear that there was no place for a German Jew who was also a Marxist in the university system in Germany. Husserl helped Marcuse join a group of academic Marxists called the Frankfurt School, because their outpost was in Frankfurt. And they had to, of course, leave Germany. They went to Switzerland and to Paris, and then eventually to the United States. And Marcuse tied up with them and broke with Heidegger. And he had never really been much of a Heideggerian, I think. I mean, he picked up some of the important ideas that Heidegger developed, but turned them into Marxist ideas. So he was a kind of, in fact, his thought was at one point called Heidegger Marxismus, Heidegger Marxism, not Marxism-Leninism, but Heidegger Marxism. So he wasn't really that close in his thinking to Heidegger, although there was a strong influence. When he moved over to the Frankfurt School, he just had to essentially break with Heidegger. And yet, a lot of those ideas that he had picked up, notions of a more technical nature, stuck with him. And that's part of what my book is about, how he managed to infuse Marxism with phenomenology, and how that eventually led him to a positive relationship to the New Left, unlike the other members of the Frankfurt School who were quite critical of the New Left. Well, so Marcuse ended up in the United States with the other members of the school in exile, and he eventually got a university appointment at Brandeis. And then when he was retired from Brandeis, he came to the University of California, San Diego. Now, I was finishing my bachelor's degree at Johns Hopkins and was looking around for a graduate school where I could do continental philosophy, what in the United States is called continental philosophy. And there were almost no places where you could do that. The philosophy profession in America at that time was totally positivist, with a little sprinkling of Wittgenstein. It was terrible, completely intolerant of any ideas that didn't fit this pseudoscientific BS that they professed. A friend of mine who knew more about what was going on in the academic world than me told me about the new University of California in San Diego, where they had hired a guy named Marcuse, who I'd never heard of. I said, what is he all about? And my friend said, he's synthesizing Marx and Freud. And I said to him, well, any place crazy enough to hire that guy is crazy enough for me. And I applied. And that's how I ended up as a student of Marcuse. Mm-hmm. And so I remained close to him for many years, even after I finished my degree. And in 68, in fact, we were there together at the beginning of the events. He escaped just before they closed all the airports. But in the early stages, when there was that early part of the movement before May 13th, he was there, and we went around and did things together. It was fascinating. So I can't really quickly explain Marcuse's thought, but I guess what made him, you have to understand that in the late 60s and early 70s, the student movement around the world was a major phenomenon, and it challenged the assumptions, that liberal assumptions of governments all over. And Marcuse became, in a sense, the sort of philosopher of this movement. And his books sold widely. Hundreds of thousands of copies of One-Dimensional Man were sold in this period. So he was really, along with Sartre, the most famous philosopher in the world for a while. And he spoke at rallies. He encouraged the students, also sometimes critical of some of the weird ideas that were circulating. But on the whole, he was in solidarity with the students, and they were enthusiastic about him. He was the grandfather of the revolution. And he had tremendous authority. So, well, it's hard to explain now because the culture is so different. At the time, there was a very strong conformist tendency. So not like now, when everybody has their favorite conspiracy theory to explain why the world is going to pot.
Right.
No, it was a time of great positive optimism and conformism, mm-hmm. which was shattered by the New Left. Mm-hmm. So our struggle was it was a different kind of struggle from what goes on today, because the society as a whole seemed to have accepted a consensus, which we challenged. And we did succeed in shattering that consensus. And that's the important outcome of the New Left. Yeah. So now today, people have no interest in the New Left. They don't remember it. They think they've done everything for the first time. But actually, all the the political culture of the United States today is completely derivative of this period in the New Left, when both the communist movement was destroyed by the consensus, and then the consensus was destroyed by the New Left, and that created openings for all the other movements that have feminism, ecology, all the social movements that have since evolved.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could kind of use this discussion of Marcuse to now switch into your thinking, because there's an interesting point that Marcuse and I think the New Left began to make about that perhaps the time of imagining emancipatory politics had shifted away from class politics, or at least exclusively class politics, into something related to technology, that in a certain sense, modern technology had reached a form of sophistication, but also of new forms of control that needed to be questioned if there was going to be a more hopeful step forward, so to speak. Before we get into your work on critical philosophy of technology, I wanted to just get a sense of a definition of this term technology itself. I think we have gadgets, phones, laptops, cars, trains. These are all different examples of it. And so I think when we often think of technology, we think of more modern technology, but it is a very old term that goes back quite some ways. So I was wondering if you could just give something of a working definition that we could then proceed forward from.
Well, people since the Neolithic times have always been making things, right? We've got these hands and thumbs. This is how we survive as a species. It's by making things. Technology, so the word technology could be used to simply refer to all the making that people engage in. But I think it's more useful to specify it, right? To say, on the one hand, there's the craft skills that people develop, which enable them to make crafted objects. And then on the other hand, there are technical objects, which are technology, which involves science, machines, automation, assembly lines, all the things that modern medicine, all the things we think of as part of our modern way of life. And these are different in pretty fundamental ways from the crafted objects that were created earlier. So I like to use the word technology to specifically to talk about modern technology and distinguish it from craft.
And you take a very interesting approach to technology. I think there is sometimes perhaps common sense assumption that technological development proceeds in a very linear fashion and inevitable fashion, as if this new phone or computer is an improvement on what came before, and the next one to come will be an improvement on this one, and they sort of solve a linear set of problems. But you take a view that is critical of this technological determinist view, as you call it, and instead, in its place, a critical or constructivist view of technology. I was wondering if you could say more about that position and how it differs.
Sure. The determinist view is widely contested now by people who study technology, but it used to be the common sense view that everyone agreed on. Now we are much more sensitive to the fact that technologies are designed, and the designs can vary over quite a wide range in many cases, without it being obvious what is the best one from a purely technical point of view. So this argument was developed in a particularly interesting way by two scholars who wrote about technology in the 80s. And they gave the example of the bicycle, the history of the bicycle. And the bicycle in the 1880s and 90s, bicycles began to be widely available, but they took two very different forms. There were two completely different designs that were in fact really different objects, not just variants on the same theme, but different objects with different purposes. So and we all know about this because everyone has seen pictures of those bicycles with huge front wheels and little back wheels. And those, of course, contrast with bicycles with wheels the same size, which are the kind we have now today. But both types coexisted in the late 19th, early 20th century. The ones that had the huge front wheels could go much faster. You have to think of them as being in high gear all the time. They didn't have gearing yet, you see. So the only way to go really fast was to have a large front wheel. And this appealed to young men who liked to race. Meanwhile, people who just wanted to go to the store and pick up a bottle of milk needed a bicycle that didn't go as fast, but was more stable. And so they had bicycles with the two front wheels the same size. So these two designs are not just technical, they're also social, right? Because they correspond to the demands of different actors, different social actors. Young men looking to impress their girlfriends by how fast they could go on their bike, and ordinary people with utilitarian purposes. These different actors then were able to translate their demands into the technical specifications of the apparatus. So this then is a model that you could apply to a great many technologies. In each case, social actors with their particular concerns manage to translate those concerns into specifications. And in some cases, that results in conflicts and controversies, as you know, over what's the best way to do the technology. So, I mean, take the example of the automobile. In the 1950s, the automobiles had two functions. They were transportation means and they were status symbols. And then what happened? Well, another actor intervened, the actor being people concerned about air pollution. And they succeeded in changing the nature of the automobile. Its technical design was changed as the demands of these actors were translated into new ways of designing the car. Catalytic converters, fuel injection systems, and so on, all resulted in an automobile which now had three functions. Still transportation, still prestige, but also protecting the environment.
I think that's very interesting, this idea that technology is not just a response to certain exclusively technical problems. It's also an expression of human relationships, of human values. I was wondering if we could then maybe circle back to this point of the concern that certain forms of modern technology, certain forms of control, as it were, are materialized into those forms of technology. I was wondering if you could say more about that, broadly speaking, and then maybe give an example as well.
You're thinking of control in the sense, in what sense? You mean like surveillance on the internet?
Yes, something like that would be really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, right now, everything we do on the internet is recorded somewhere and used to create all kinds of different things, recommendation systems, AI now, it's the latest, um, targeted advertising. Um, the police use it, right, to find people. And so the fact that the digital technology allows for the inexpensive recording of everything that is digitized makes us very vulnerable to controls of all sorts. Some subtle, like the targeted advertising, which doesn't actually force you to do anything, but it's very effective apparently. And others, which are more prominent in certain countries and with dictatorial regimes, have to do with the actual, physical control of people through policing. You can find out who doesn't want to wear a hijab in Iran, who doesn't like the war in Ukraine and Russia, and you can put people in jail. So technology has potentials there, both soft and hard potentials for controlling individuals. There's another sort of a larger framework which Marcuse developed, which is the role of consumption, of private consumption, which the organizing everyday life around private consumption creates a certain kind of society, a society in which people are less involved in social and political collective endeavors and more cut off in their own private sphere. And competition for the consumer goods becomes a major factor in people's existence. So this consumer society is an effect of the available technology, right? You could imagine, again, we talk about cars, transportation. In some cities, the transportation systems are highly developed. Collective public transportation systems are highly developed, which makes the automobile less salient in people's existence. In the United States, it's impossible in many places to live without a car. In Paris or Amsterdam, you can get along quite well without a car. So you have very different urban designs. You think of this as also a technological issue, right? What's the urban design?
Right.
Well,
right.
So the whole mentality of the society is shaped by the urban design, by the focus on private consumption, material goods, and so this Marcuse was critical of this. He was not alone. There was a lot of criticism of this as a way of life.
I think what's very interesting in your approach, this critical constructivist view of technology allows it a certain plasticity. So in places where there are either more implicit, sometimes more explicit forms of control, does not mean that technology is necessarily doomed to function in that way. It can, in principle, be transformed. And you often cite a way of imagining a different approach to technology is through democratic management. In a certain way, it imagines some of that idea of socialist politics, democratic management of industry, but now in forms of technological development. I was wondering if we could speak to the ways in which you might imagine a a democratic management of something like the internet might look like. Just in light of if you don't mind, another quote that I from your work, Technosystem, if I can read it, and then we can talk about it. You say the internet is a terrain of struggle rather than a definite thing with a singular essence. And so in a certain way, you have an optimism about how the internet can be reimagined in this form. So I was wondering what it might look like.
A few years ago, just before COVID, I attended a meeting in Germany at a conference center that hosts meetings of computer scientists. And so I was the philosopher present. The reason I was there was because a whole bunch of computer scientists were desperately concerned about what had happened to the internet. These are people who had created the technologies that were now being deployed by companies like Facebook, and they didn't like the results. It reminded me of what happened to the physicists who made the atom bomb. They were not happy with the results, and they tried to, in the case of the atom bomb, they tried to develop treaties to control it. In this case, these computer scientists were interested in reconfiguring the internet and using the technology in a different way. And that might mean, for example, blocking surveillance, right? And I was thinking about this recently. In the beginning, I was involved in using online communication in 1981, 1982. At that time, there was no surveillance. No one was collecting the data. I mean, that was ridiculous. It was so expensive to use the systems, and memory was so expensive that it would never have occurred to anyone to do what is now routine. So how did we work? Well, it wasn't impossible. You could use a search engine to find things that interested you. Instead of a system like the Facebook system of, telling you who you might want to have as a friend, you'd have to do a search and look for people who had shared interests. And you could function perfectly well that way. We did okay. So these people are thinking in terms of how to block the surveillance by encrypting the data so that it can't be reused by companies and police. And so might they succeed? Well, I mean, that's a question, right? They could actually, of course, they now have far more sophisticated systems than I had in 1982. They should be able to figure out something that would work and that would be just as useful as the present system, but without its inconveniences, without the surveillance. So in one way, it's simple. Surveillance is a practice that you can outlaw. So the law can solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In Europe, they're trying sort of feebly to control surveillance, but it could be, if people become sufficiently excited about the inconveniences, they could outlaw it altogether, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like, you have to create some entirely new invention, right? This is the opposite. Just get rid of an invention.
Right.
So that's a lot simpler. And then find other ways for people to interact and find each other and find the things that interest them. I think all this is quite possible, but it would require a political will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that political will so far has not manifested itself. It's actually rather remarkable how passive people have become. So, for example, I received 2, 3, sometimes 5 spam calls a day on the phone. It's absurd. Why? Why is there no attempt to stop this? So surveillance is a similar problem, you know, people are annoyed about it, they don't like it, but nothing's happening. So perhaps there's some sort of moment of passivity in the population that explains why these companies have managed to transform the internet into a monster.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that moment of passivity will pass.
Yeah.
And we'll again have a public that is engaged. And at that point, I'll stop getting these spam calls, and surveillance maybe will be outlawed.
Right. Right. It feels like this more democratic approach of managing the internet might also go some way in um, preventing this tunnel vision that people can sometimes get in their own particular worldview. You mentioned this kind of spread of conspiracy theorizing, and it seems like to some degree the perhaps the design of the internet as it exists now kind of confines different perspectives as opposed to allowing for, as you say, a more expansive cooperative interaction among people. um,
I have, well, I have some questions about
yeah.
that. Is the internet really responsible?
Hmm.
Well, I mean, it used to be that television generated a consensus, right? In the good old days, television was very much curated, moderated, right? You could not on TV spout certain kinds of things like racist comments and so on. And that's because corporations, which produce the broadcasts, wanted to appeal to the widest possible spectrum of viewers. Now, when we first began to use online communication, we had the feeling that we were breaking with this consensus produced by the corporation's desire to reach the broadest possible audience. So this would favor the development of more of a wider range of opinions. And at first, it seemed like the left had succeeded in enlarging the range of opinions through the internet. But other people with other ideas gradually figured out how to use the internet. And so vulnerable populations that were easily fooled and propagandized into these right-wing conspiracy theories were able to develop a presence on the internet and on a large scale. And now we talk mostly about the conspiracy theories and not about the initiatives, the public initiatives that the left attempted, like Occupy Wall Street. So how are we supposed to understand this? I mean, should we think that after all that it's the internet that's caused this to happen? That doesn't seem right to me. It's not the internet that's caused it. There's something wrong in the culture that has been favored by the breakdown of the consensus view that television vehiculated in the old days.
Interesting.
So so, I mean, for example, consider racism. Is racism caused by the internet? That seems very implausible. It's been there ever since, before the Civil War. It's been the basis for the Southern strategy that Nixon developed long before the internet was around. Now it can be articulated in public more easily, but it was there all along. So what the internet is doing is enabling the nasty parts of the culture to become visible. And that, of course, may also enhance not just their visibility, but also their extent, their reach. But it's still fundamentally a problem in the culture, not with the technology. Now, operations like Facebook try and control, to some extent, the nastiness. And this is because, I don't think it's because of a humane and liberal outlook. It's because of business is still concerned about that wide consensus. It still wants to reach the widest number of people possible, just like in the good old days of television. And you can't do that if you're busy if you're associated with racism, you're going to lose a lot of people who would otherwise buy your products. So there's a strong incentive then to try and control what goes on the internet. But it's much more difficult than with television. In the case of television, one guy can say, well, so-and-so has racist views that we don't want to see on our broadcast because that'll annoy Ford Motor Company that would rather reach everybody and not just racists. So let's get those people out. And one guy can say that. In the case of the internet, they've got huge numbers of people trying to monitor the most extreme cases, China, right, where they have thousands, hundreds of thousands of people monitoring what goes on so they can quickly remove things that don't fit with the government's view. In our case, it's more difficult to get control. The companies have budgets, and the budgets don't allow. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't need to worry about budgets, but businesses do. And the number of people you'd need, imagine for Facebook to actually control what's said, not only in the US, but all over the world. It's just impossible. So now if you broke up these companies, then there'd be no moderation at all. People would find each other. It might make things worse. It's not certain. On the other hand, maybe I don't know. I haven't really thought through the implications.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think we have to go back, not imagine that a technology can cause the problems that we possess as a society, but look at the culture and its sources and the institutions which are the source of it.
Yeah. I was wondering if I could maybe ask one more question related just to the philosophical content of your work, this time related to democratic management of technology with respect to the environment. Recently there have been a number of these incidents of train derailments. The one that first came on to my radar was the one in East Palestine, Ohio, back in February, and of course causing this just horrific release of toxic chemicals into the environment and into people's neighborhood, the residents of the neighborhood. And come to find out, for nearly a decade, workers of this company and of many companies had been protesting the lack of adequate staffing, overwork, lack of modernizing the technology. but through various means, they had either been silenced or sort of placated in some way. And we see directly the implications of not having enough democratic control of industry having really nasty effects for people and for the environment. So I was wondering how, on the other side of it, in the case where there is a more expansive, a greater number of voices that can participate in technological management, do you think it would go some way in addressing those kinds of problems, or is there also something more to the story, do you think?
Well, we live in a capitalist society, and when capitalism was in its beginnings, it invented a new form of property, which had never existed before. This is a form of property that was indifferent to the lives of workers and communities. You could do your thing without worrying about the people and the places that you were operating in. Formerly, I mean, there were all kinds of terrible things that happened in pre-modern times and pre-capitalist societies, but you had responsibilities if you were a powerful person or the people under your command. Now, capitalism created this new form of property where you have no responsibility to anybody. Now, of course, gradually laws were implemented to create some forms of responsible ownership, but it's still the case that there's this strange indifference which results in, you know, accidents like East Palestine is a community, but the company, Norfolk Southern, I think, goes through that community without any concern about the welfare of that community. It's just not interested. So this is still the good old days of capitalism, right? Where you can just ignore the needs of people who aren't your shareholders. So again, the answer is regulation. But of course, the governments are so easily controlled by money, you know, I mean, it's just about money. So these companies get what they want out of the governments. And eventually, of course, some disaster occurs like this thing in East Palestine. Then people start to say, well, we've got to do something. And maybe they will, you know. Sometimes the behavior of companies is so egregious that regulation is finally implemented. But the default is no regulation. The default is we're not responsible. And that default can lead to pretty bad situations, huge problems like toxic waste, for example. There's billions and billions of dollars are being spent to try and undo the dumping of toxic waste all over the country. Now you're supposed to get rid of it, but you know, who's going to pay? What about dead oil wells? Who's going to pay to deal with the consequences, the environmental consequences? So this, I mean, you know, capitalism has its positive side. It does succeed in making the economy more efficient in many respects, but it also has some pretty serious negative sides. And the regime of government control by business tends to exaggerate those negative sides far more than is really necessary. So there's absolutely no reason you don't have to have a socialist revolution to make railroads clear their tracks properly and put enough people on the trains to manage the. I mean, it's absurd that there should be such an accident. Huh? Just ridiculous. But it happens because they have lobbied their way into control and to irresponsibility.
Right. I think as far in terms of philosophical questions, I think that'll wrap it up. I just have a few more questions in terms of kind of your next work and some advice that you might have. So the next question would be, I know that you recently released this book on Marcuse, but was wondering if you have other new projects on the horizon and what they might be.
I haven't really figured out what to do next. It took quite a long time to get the Marcuse book through. Of course, that was mostly during COVID when it was, you just didn't have much interaction with other people. And I was looking at a lot of things I've written about the history of Marxism. Maybe I'll do something with that. I've got all these essays. Perhaps they could be put into a book. But then on the other hand, I think maybe I should do something new. But what? I'm not sure yet.
Wonderful. And just as a last question, you talked a lot about these the formative experience of May 68. You're working with Herbert Marcuse and how that shaped your thought. I was wondering if you had any advice that you would like to share for young and upcoming philosophers about where they might kind of go next.
You're perhaps you should replay.
Oh,
because my internet connection is unstable.
Oh no. Okay. Yeah. It did cut out there for a second, so I'll go ahead and I'll restate it one time.
You can always.
Yeah. I was just wondering if that you spoke about the formative experience of May 68. You're working with Herbert Marcuse and how these affected you as a young philosopher. And I was wondering if you had advice for young and upcoming philosophers about where they might go next.
Oh yeah, that's a big question. Now, of course, philosophy is no longer as terrible as it was when I was going to graduate school. There's now much more variety. Even so, it's not easy to find a place if you're interested in European thought, you're interested in Marxism, phenomenology, French theory. It's not that easy to find a school that will give you a good education in that field. And certainly even harder to find a place that'll hire you once you've finished your degree. So I can't really enthusiastically endorse the idea of studying philosophy in the US at this time. However, there is more flexibility in other parts of the university. For example, in the field of education, in the field of communication and sociology, there are possibilities there for people who might have some interest in those fields. And I'm not sure that isn't the better way to go, since it's so difficult to work in philosophy. It's really shameful what the intolerance of so many philosophers for things they aren't interested in, don't understand, don't want to study. But that's not a reason to reject them entirely. So I think it's a difficult field to work in. I've been in a communication department for the last 20 years. Another person who worked on Marcuse, Doug Kellner, has been in an education department. I can't remember. I think Sandra Harding is a philosopher of feminism. I think she's in sociology. So you can find people in these other fields where they have a little more room for maneuver. They're a little less stigmatized by their strange ideas. So that's what I would recommend.
Right. Wonderful. Well, that will conclude our interview. Professor Feenberg, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Aporia Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.